We asked Prime Minister John Key to appear on the programme. He declined, but we are joined now by our Senior National Minister Stephen Joyce, the man who stood in for the Prime Minister in Question Time on Thursday. Good morning, Minister. I see you've been furiously taking notes.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that before Mr Harumph that we've just had on gets to harumph his way to oblivion. The reality is a couple of things. Firstly, this is the same opposition who are demanding to see the emails between Peter Dunne and Andrea Vance just a couple of weeks ago. So
that's
no, it's a very important
it's not,
story.
Because this is the same as the media.
No, it goes to context because I'm sorry, it goes to context because the reality is, we'll go
Minister,
into the.
I think it's irrelevant.
What is relevant? Because
is this the end of it? Is this the end of the breaches?
What is relevant is that you had a opposition demanding these emails be released.
They've got nothing to do with what's happened, though.
It's irrelevant. No, it is not irrelevant because we're going to come to next. I see why you're sensitive about it, because the media are also demanding for these emails to release. There's a number of OIAs in right now which have not been withdrawn, seeking the emails between Peter Dunne and Andrea Vance. And I'm sorry, it is a little hypocritical for both elements of the media and also.
Mr Joyce, that this is it. No, I'm asking the questions with respect. Can you give us a 100% assurance?
I've just had 15 minutes of accusations.
No,
we won't. We'll do it in this order.
Can you give us a 100? No, we'll do it in the order I say with respect.
Well, no, we won't.
Can you give us a 100% assurance?
We'll have a meeting and an agreement of what order we do it in. No.
Is this it? Is this it?
Is this what?
Is this can you give 100% assurance that no more? Every time you open a door, there's another revelation. Is this it? Do we know everything?
Well, I literally don't know the answer to that question, but we do know.
Well, you should be able to say, surely. Because everything's coming out of dribs and drabs.
Well, this is another point. Our dear friend, Mr Norman, is acting as if the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Prime Minister's office and the Parliamentary Service are all one and the same thing. The reality is they're not. And in fact, they're all very independent of each other, as we can see by the way in which this has unfolded. Okay. So if you take the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is an independent public service entity run by a public service chief executive, yesterday they supplied the information in regards to those emails. Now, if you're the government, i.e. Prime Minister and his staff and ministers, you probably would have preferred that come out a long time ago. But they are independent. They were secretarial to the inquiry. Okay. When they were asked, as a result of the question of Mr Norman in Parliament on Thursday to me, when they were asked, they turned around and said, oh, well, we better give all these out.
Okay, but I don't want to talk about the opposition parties. I want to talk about what the government's doing.
I was talking about the Prime Minister and Cabinet.
I want to talk about, if you read through the 130 pages, which we saw yesterday, some would say cynically, dumped late yesterday afternoon.
Again, I have to address that because
those emails you constantly see.
No, you can't make accusations in a question and not let me answer them. No, let me answer it, please. Because the reality of it was that those were supplied as soon as they could have been collated. And that's really important. Okay. Because these things you get done either way, because if they'd been held, because we'd worried about the fact that it looked a bit suspicious that it was Friday afternoon, then on Monday they would have said, when did you find out? And why has it taken until today to release that information? So I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. The information was collated and released as soon as it was available.
Let's talk about the information then. 130 pages of emails.
Yep.
And throughout it, you see constantly people seeking clarification. Jeff Thorne, Wayne Eagleson, what they can do, what can't they do, what can they authorise.
Yep.
Why wasn't that clarified beforehand?
Well, I think it's a very good question, particularly for Parliamentary Service. And as we know, Mr Thorne has resigned over the issues that have been raised through this. And actually, this is one place where I'm about to agree with Dr Norman. So hold that thought, because I'm about to agree with Dr Norman. The Privileges Committee should clarify those things, because it's quite obvious if you look through those emails, the level of clarity was not in place. Now, the Prime Minister has made it clear that he does not think it is appropriate, and he said this all the way through, for Andrea Vance's records to be released. That happened in the terms of building access.
Some clarification then beforehand, shouldn't there?
Well, the reality.
He called the inquiry.
Well, no, the clarification, the calling of the inquiry made it very clear it was about the ministers and their staff. And I'm sure if the Prime Minister would make no apology for seeking the information in relation to ministers and their staff, but not in relation to Ms Vance. And it is appropriate for the Privileges Committee to address that, because in this day and age, unlike 20 or 30 years ago, the reality is that information is held by somebody, because that's the nature of building access records and emails and those sorts of things. So then the question has to be addressed as to what should be released. And I think we can all agree, and this is where I find myself agreeing with Dr Norman, we can all agree that the media's information in that regard should not be released for the obvious reasons.
Does Andrea Vance then deserve an apology?
Does Andrea Vance deserve an apology? Well, I think she's had an apology from the Speaker, and she's had an apology from from Mr. Kibblewhite as late as last evening. He's the head of the Department of Prime Minister.
What about
and
John Key, his inquiry?
Well, that's over for him, but I think the reality is, well, he's been very clear all the way through that he was not happy that that information was passed
and
across.
it has, and it was his inquiry, so should he say to Andrea Vance, I'm extremely sorry about what's happened?
Well, I literally don't know what conversations have taken place, but the reality is the staff involved did exceed their brief by accident in 2 or 3 cases, and we know that was by accident. And it is important to note, and it's not good enough, but the emails weren't read by anybody.
Okay.
So that's the reality of the situation. But it is, I think, important that we have clarity, very clear clarity, that the media's information within that building should not be supplied.
The government prides itself, your government prides itself on getting things done,
That's right.
getting around the bureaucracy. Does this also show it's got a pretty relaxed attitude towards process?
No. In fact,
how can that not show that it's a relaxed attitude?
In fact, it shows the reverse, right? Firstly, 2 things. One is that all those emails back and forth that you saw released yesterday were about process. Who had authorisation for what?
And needing clarification.
That's right.
And that's misunderstanding. A bit of a she'll be right attitude.
And they were I don't think that's fair to the individuals involved, and I think you need to be a bit careful about that because that isn't fair to the individuals involved. But the other point is that actually the absolute criticism, according to Mr. Robertson, is that this stuff should have been supplied earlier. Well, the reason it's supplied yesterday is because of the distance between the inquiry and the Prime Minister's office. So on the one hand, he's criticising us for not having distance, and now there is distance and information is supplied when the DPMC decides to supply it. Somehow that is a bad thing. You can't have it both ways.
On May 23rd, so that's 3 days after the email was sent back, the email that had been incorrectly sent with all the content of the conversation between Dunne and Vance, David Henry was still asking Parliamentary Service how to access that, how to open it.
Well, the key thing there is that in relation to ministers, the Prime Minister, as through his Chief of Staff, had authorised for ministers' information to be provided. And that is important because actually
Mr.
Dunne's view is that that shouldn't have happened. But the reality is, in terms of an inquiry of this type, all ministers, myself included, as I was one of those ones under suspicion, has to be prepared to provide the information because you only serve in a ministerial warrant with the Prime Minister's decision. It's his decision whether to give or take back a warrant, and he said, and it's entirely fair, that my ministers need to provide the information. And as we know, Mr. Dunne refused to supply the information. Mr. Dunne accepted that he was planning to provide the report. He was planning to provide the report to Ms. Vance, and as a result of not supplying the information, he resigned his warrant.
Okay, and David Henry tells one story and Peter Dunne tells another.
Yep.
Who do you believe?
Well, I believe Mr. Henry in that respect. I mean, don't forget Mr. Dunne was refusing to supply the information. Now, at the end of the day, that's something between Mr. Dunne and Mr. Henry.
So you're saying Peter Dunne's lying?
No, I'm saying Mr. Dunne refused to supply the information, which he did refuse to supply.
You believe David Henry's story?
And as a result, he resigned his warrant.
And you believe David Henry's story, though?
Well, I'm thinking that Mr. Henry has no particular reason to offer a different view. Now, Mr. Dunne at the end of the day, there were 2 people having a conversation. We can all debate what they might have meant, and it's obvious the 2 of them took different things out of that conversation.
Given what's occurred here, given the level of concern that it's triggered...
From Mr. Robertson and Mr. Norman particularly.
Do you
who
believe...
are, of course, disinterested bystanders.
There is concern in the public. There is great concern in the public too.
I'm not convinced that there's as much concern as certain elements of the media and the 2 opposition people.
Do you believe John Key should appear before the Privileges Committee on this?
Well, I think it's for the Prime Minister to decide, but actually I don't, because the reality of it is that the information was either inadvertently supplied and then deleted, or else it was actually supplied, in particular the building access records, erroneously. And the Prime Minister made it clear that he was not happy with that at the time, and we note that Mr. Thorne has resigned.
OK, sure, but, we asked for John Key to come on the programme and he said, no, you offered yourself up, so you should be able to respond to that question as the government spokesperson.
Well, at the end of the day, I don't think that he should do anything more than he thinks that he should do in that regard. The reality of it is the Privileges Committee has been asked to determine the appropriate rules around these sorts of access. And that's what they've been asked to determine. Now, with the greatest respect to our friend Mr. Norman and our friend Mr. Robertson, who are not disinterested bystanders in this regard, they can't have it both ways. They can't be arguing for all this information to be released to get to the bottom of it. They've stood in the Parliament for weeks on end and said, the Prime Minister should be getting to the bottom of this. And now they're saying, oh, it's outrageous, he almost got to the bottom of it. That's just absolutely pathetic politics.
Stephen Joyce, Senior National Party Minister, thank you.